If you use VBA, well then you're going to get errors. Now this is not a problem because most of them are easy to resolve. What we're going to look at here is the different type of errors and how you can fix them. So the first error we'll look at is the syntax error. So from the menu you can select Tools, Options, and in the dialog that appears, ensure that Auto Syntax Check is ticked. Now what this will do, it will automatically check each line of code as you enter it. So here we enter sub, and if we try to go to the next line we get an error because this line has a syntax error, and the error is an expected identifier. Now what it means by identifier is that we left out the name. So let's click OK and enter the name, and you'll see that the line is now fine. So let's have a look at another example. Here we declare dim I as, and we leave out the type. So when we go to another line you can see we get the expected new or type name. Now new is here because we can also use new as when declaring a new type. Now once we enter the type, the line will be OK and the colour will no longer be red. So this time we're going to enter a for statement and we're not going to complete it. So we've just said for I equals. So VBA knows that we need some kind of expression after the equals. So let's add in a number here, and this time we try and leave the line, and VBA tells us that it expected the word 2. So you can see most of these errors are fairly self-explanatory, although sometimes they may appear cryptic. So now when we add this value you can see the for statement is fine. Now let's have a look at an if statement. Now one thing to remember with the syntax error is that it only checks a line. So now in this case we're expecting a then or a go to because this comes after the condition. And once we enter it's fine. So you can see that if and for, both of these lines are fine. However, both are missing their terminating lines. In other words, if is missing end if and for is missing next. But the syntax check only checks the current line, and it only checks the syntax is correct. So in this case we're going to print out the worksheet. Now we've left out the second parenthesis here, and you can see it says expected list separator or parenthesis. Now if we leave out the quote we get the same error, and the reason for this is that everything after the quote is considered text. So VBA doesn't see the second parenthesis. So it's just important to be aware of this error. Now when we put in the second quote, this line will pass the syntax check, but this line is not valid because it's printing out a worksheet which doesn't make sense. It can only print out the worksheet name or some property of the worksheet. But as long as the syntax is fine, it will pass the syntax check. It's the compiler check that will check if this is true or false. So here again, in cells, we left out, when we just put in one parameter, it still worked. And that's because parameters are optional. But once we put in a comma, we must place a parameter after it. And now you can see cells is fine. So to make your life easier, what I have is a list of the different errors, and we can call this the translator list. And here you can see a list of the different error messages, a possible cause, an example of the cause, and the example corrected. So you may find this very useful when you're starting out with VBA. So let's have a look at one here. The expected equals. The equal sign is missing from a for statement. So an example here is a for statement with no equals, and how to correct it is to simply add the equals. Now you'll find this list very useful when you're starting with VBA, but as you get more familiar with the errors, you'll resolve them much quicker. So you can download this PDF file at the end of this section. We're now going to look at the next stage of errors, and these are compiler errors. Now the difference with a compiler error is that it relates to more than one line, and the easiest way to explain this is with some examples. So you can see this line here, the for loop. Now the syntax here is correct, however we don't have a next statement, and every for loop must come with a next statement. So let's compile this code. We select debug and compile to compile it. and this essentially means that VBA checks the code for errors. So we see the error for without next, and this is fairly self-explanatory. Now if we were to run the code, we'd get the same error. And so when we run it, you see for without next. Now the difference between running and debugging is that run only shows errors in code that it's going to use. So in other words, if it only runs one macro, this will be the only macro it checks for errors. Debug, however, checks all the code in the current project. So it's always a good idea to use debug compile to check your code for errors before you run it. So now let's try the if statement. Again, the format of this statement is correct: if, a condition, and then. However, we don't have a matching if, so it says block if without end if. Now sometimes the descriptions can be a bit formal, but if you just think about them for a second, they're generally straightforward. Now we place our end if and the code will compile fine. So now let's copy this macro. So now we've got two macros with the same name, and this is not allowed. So let's compile it, and we see the error we get is ambiguous name detected, and that name is test. So at first this sounds complex, but it's fairly obvious what the problem is when we think about it for a moment. Now, by default in VBA, we can use a variable without declaring it. And this is not a good idea, because if we accidentally spell a variable wrong, we'll be using a variable that hasn't been declared already. So we'll have two variables rather than one. So it's always a good idea to make sure the user declares a variable. And here you can see it didn't give an error. So what we want to do is for the compiler to recognize this as an error. So we simply add option explicit to the top of our module. And what this means is that we must explicitly declare a variable. So now if we want this placed in all of our modules, we simply check on the box require variable declaration and click OK, and then each new module we create will have option explicit at the top, and there you can see option explicit at the top of our new module. So now we're going to look at a final error. Now in this case we're going to declare a variable twice, and this can happen very easy in your code. Now in a few lines of code it's obvious, but imagine if your macro had 20 or 30 lines of code. So in this case we declare two variables at the top, and then we go further down, write some code, and then we declare the variable again by mistake. Now if we compile this, VBA gives us this error: duplicate declaration in current scope. Now at first glance this seems quite complicated, but if you think about it for a second, it is actually straightforward. So it's important to recognize this error because it can happen quite easily. Now in this lesson we went through some common errors that you can see with the compiler, and this should make it easy to recognize them if you see them yourself. So the final error that we can get is runtime errors. And runtime errors are errors that only occur at runtime, and this makes them more difficult to detect. Now the easiest way to explain a runtime error is with an example. So we have some code here, and what the code does is reads a value from the cell C1, places it in a long integer, and then writes the value to the user in a message box. So the first thing we should always do is compile our code before we run it. So now we know that the code compiles, so the syntax of the code is fine, and actually it even runs fine this time. Now imagine the user inadvertently changes the number to text, so accidentally places text in this field. This time we run this code and we get a type mismatch error. Now it's very important to recognize this error because it happens frequently in VBA. So if you see type mismatch, generally you've got text in a field where the field is expecting a number. Now the second type of error is a bit trickier to detect because it doesn't result in an error message. So in this case, what we're doing is we're writing the value to Monday. So we have a value here, 4 9s, and we want to write it to Monday. But when we run this code, you'll notice that this value is actually writing to Tuesday. And this is simply because we have a typo. We should have C7 rather than D7. So this is another type of runtime error. It's one that doesn't cause an error even though our code is behaving incorrectly. And the easiest way, or the normal way we detect these errors, is when we test our code, or when we test the results we get. There's no one simple way of fixing runtime errors because they come in all shapes and sizes. However, using the debugging tools will help you resolve the vast majority of them.